start the book. Spilled Milk. Introduction. Finding voice through the silence. In a world that often demands quiet compliance from victims, Spilled Milk stands as a breathtaking testament to the raw power of breaking one's silence. This profound memoir navigates the harrowing labyrinth of childhood abuse, the betrayal of the very people meant to protect us, and the grueling fight for justice within a flawed system. By chronicling her journey from a terrified child to a fierce advocate, the author offers a beacon of hope, proving that trauma does not have to dictate the final chapter of our lives. Point 1. The illusion of a safe suburban home. Every neighborhood has that one house that looks entirely unremarkable from the street, perfectly manicured and quiet, yet hiding a completely different reality behind its closed doors. For young Brooke, the protagonist and author of our story, the front door of her family home was not a welcoming threshold, but rather a terrifying boundary line between the normal outside world and a private, inescapable nightmare. To the outside observer, Brooke's family painted the perfect picture of suburban normalcy. Her father was a charismatic man, someone who could easily strike up a conversation with neighbors, charm the local shopkeepers, and present himself as a hardworking provider. He wore the mask of a dedicated family man with chilling perfection. However, the moment the front door clicked shut and the deadbolt slid into place, that mask dissolved into something monstrous. The atmosphere in the house would shift instantly, dropping 10 degrees the moment his car tires crunched onto the gravel of the driveway. The children developed a hyper-vigilant sixth sense, an agonizing radar tuned to the exact pitch of his footsteps, the way he slammed his car door, and the heaviness of his breath. This is a survival mechanism deeply embedded in the psychology of abused children. They become masters of reading the weather of their abuser's mood because their physical safety depends entirely on forecasting the storm. The title of the book itself, Spilled Milk, is a brilliant and tragic metaphor for the environment in which Brooke was forced to survive. In a healthy household, spilling a glass of milk is a trivial accident, met with a sigh, a paper towel, and perhaps a gentle reminder to be more careful. In Brooke's house, a minor infraction like spilled milk was an act of treason that could trigger an apocalyptic explosion of physical and emotional violence. The punishment never fit the crime. The father's rage was a living, breathing entity that occupied the house alongside them, taking up all the oxygen in the room. He ruled through a regime of absolute terror, utilizing physical beatings, severe emotional degradation, and unspeakable sexual abuse to assert complete dominance over his household. Living under such tyranny forces a child to compartmentalize their existence. During the day, Brooke had to navigate the halls of her school, sit at her desk, and pretend to care about math equations and playground gossip. She had to smile at her teachers and blend in with peers whose biggest worries were curfews and unrequited crushes. This dual life creates an agonizing cognitive dissonance. It is incredibly difficult to focus on a history lesson when your body is covered in bruises you have to hide beneath long sleeves, and your mind is consumed by the dread of what awaits you when the final school bell rings. Brooke's early years were entirely defined by this suffocating silence. She was taught, both explicitly by her father's threats and implicitly by her environment, that the secrets of the house must never cross the threshold. The insidious nature of this abuse lay not just in the physical pain, but in the systematic dismantling of Brooke's self-worth. Her father did not merely want to hurt her, he needed to break her spirit so entirely that she would never dare to dream of escaping. He isolated the family, ensuring that the children had no safe harbor, no trusted adults to turn to, and no baseline for what a healthy, loving relationship should look like. To understand Brooke's childhood is to understand the concept of a psychological hostage situation. The children were prisoners of war in their own bedrooms. They learned to walk on the balls of their feet to avoid making the floorboards creak. They learned to swallow their tears because crying only invited more violence. Yet, even in this dark, oppressive environment, tiny sparks of resilience began to flicker within Brooke. While her father tried to rewrite her reality, telling her she was worthless and that the abuse was somehow her fault, a small, fiercely protected part of her soul knew this was a lie. She observed the world around her, soaking in the interactions of other families, reading books, and quietly building an internal sanctuary that her father could not touch. This internal sanctuary was built on a foundation of profound empathy. Despite the cruelty she endured, she did not become cruel. She watched her siblings suffer and felt a deep, protective urge over them. This empathy would eventually become the catalyst for her survival. The illusion of the safe suburban home was a heavy curtain, but as Brooke grew older, she began to realize that curtains could be pulled back, and the monsters hiding in the dark could be exposed to the light. Point 2. The weight of unspoken family secrets. Carrying a secret of severe abuse is like carrying a backpack full of heavy stones that grows exponentially heavier with every passing day, eventually threatening to completely crush the person forced to bear it. As Brooke transitioned from a confused young girl into a teenager, the psychological burden of her father's horrific actions began to seep into every single aspect of her existence, forcing her to confront not only his monstrous behavior, but the devastating complicity of those who stood by and watched. The most complex and heartbreaking dynamic in Brooke's story is not just the violence of the father, but the agonizing role of the mother. In the narrative of domestic abuse, the non-offending parent often occupies a gray area that is incredibly difficult for an outsider to comprehend, but deeply traumatic for the child to experience. Brooke's mother was in the house. She saw the bruises. She heard the screams. She knew exactly what kind of predator she was married to, yet she chose the path of willful blindness. For a child, the abuser's actions are terrifying, but the silence of the other parent is a profound, soul-shattering betrayal. It sends a clear, devastating message. Your pain is not as important as my comfort, my fear, or my denial. To survive her own terror, the mother had constructed an elaborate fortress of delusion. She minimized the father's outburst, normalized his erratic behavior, and implicitly demanded that the children play along with the charade to keep the peace. This forced Brooke into an impossible emotional corner. She was desperately craving a maternal protector, someone to scoop her up, lock the door, and tell the monster to go away. Instead, she was repeatedly sacrificed on the altar of her mother's denial. When a child is abused, they naturally look to the other parent for rescue. When that rescue never comes, the child is forced to process a dual trauma: the active abuse from one parent and the passive abandonment from the other. The family dynamic morphed into a twisted ecosystem of survival. The siblings, all trapped in the same nightmare, did not always band together as one might hope. Trauma does strange things to human bonds. Sometimes it unites people, but often in environments of extreme scarcity of love and safety, it pits them against one another. The father expertly played the children against each other, creating a hierarchy of victimhood that kept them divided and weak. If one child was the target of his wrath on a Tuesday, the others would instinctively distance themselves, silently praying the target wouldn't shift to them. It is a brutal Darwinian existence where self-preservation overrides sibling loyalty. Brooke found herself navigating this minefield, carrying not only her own trauma, but the agonizing guilt of watching her siblings suffer and being completely powerless to stop it. The weight of these secrets began to manifest in Brooke's daily life. The mental toll of holding in such dark truths led to overwhelming anxiety, a constant state of fight or flight that exhausted her nervous system. She was a teenager trying to figure out her identity, her friendships, and her future, all while dragging this massive invisible anchor behind her. Consider the sheer energy it takes to lie every single day. When a friend asks, "Why can't you come over?" or a teacher asks, "Where did you get that bruise?" the mind has to instantly invent a plausible, airtight story. Brooke became a master storyteller out of necessity, weaving fictions about clumsy falls and strict grounding to protect the very man who was destroying her. But secrets of this magnitude are inherently unstable. Like a pressure cooker left on a high flame with no release valve, the internal pressure within Brooke was building toward a catastrophic failure. She began to realize that the family secret was not protecting her, it was slowly suffocating her. The father's control was absolute, but it relied entirely on her silence. He repeatedly drilled into her head that if she ever told anyone, the family would be ripped apart, she would be blamed, and no one would ever believe her anyway. This is the classic playbook of a predator. They weaponize the victim's love for their family, turning their own empathy against them. Brooke's internal monologue during these years was a desperate tug of war between the paralyzing fear of her father's retribution and a growing, desperate hunger to simply breathe free air. She started to recognize the profound injustice of her situation. Why should she have to cover her body in shame? Why should she have to flinch every time a door slammed? The unspoken secrets were a poison, and Brooke was intuitively realizing that the only antidote was the truth. It is a terrifying realization for a victim to understand that the only way out of the nightmare is to detonate the bomb that will blow up their entire life. But the alternative, living forever in the dark, silent shadow of a monster, was rapidly becoming unendurable. The backpack of stones was simply getting too heavy to carry alone. Point 3. A desperate cry for help. There comes a breaking point in every survivor's journey where the exhausting fear of speaking out is finally eclipsed by the absolute suffocating terror of staying silent a moment longer. For Brooke, this monumental, life-altering pivot did not arrive with a cinematic explosion or a dramatic confrontation, but rather with a quiet, desperately terrified decision to finally let the truth escape her trembling lips and fall into the hands of someone who could help. The decision to disclose abuse is rarely a sudden impulse. It is the culmination of years of internal debate, failed attempts, and the slow gathering of an almost superhuman courage. Brooke had reached the edge of her endurance. The abuse had escalated, the psychological warfare at home was unbearable, and the realization that her father would never stop and that her mother would never intervene finally crystallized in her mind. She understood that if she wanted to live, if she wanted any chance at a future that didn't involve cowering in fear, she had to be her own savior. The setting for this profound turning point was the sterile yet oddly comforting environment of school. Schools often serve as the only safe haven for abused children, a place where the rules are predictable, adults are generally kind, and the chaos of home cannot reach them. Brooke chose to confide in a trusted figure within the school system. Walking down the hallway toward that office felt like walking to her own execution. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her palms sweat profusely, and every instinct trained into her by her father screamed at her to turn around, go back to class, and keep her mouth shut. The psychological barrier of the family secret is incredibly dense. Breaking it feels like jumping out of an airplane without being entirely sure the parachute is packed. When Brooke finally sat down and forced the words out, the atmosphere in the room shifted irrevocably. Saying the words aloud, vocalizing the horrific acts her father had committed, was a surreal experience. For so long, the abuse had lived only in the dark corners of her mind, in the locked rooms of her house. By speaking it into the air, she made it real to the outside world. This moment of disclosure is a profound act of bravery. It is a child looking at a massive, terrifying system and deciding to trust it, despite having been taught her whole life that adults cannot be trusted. The immediate aftermath of the disclosure was a whirlwind of terrifying velocity. Once the machinery of mandated reporting is activated, the child loses all control over the narrative. Brooke was no longer just a teenager. She was now the central figure in a criminal investigation in a child protective services case. The school counselor had to make the call. The police were notified, social workers were dispatched. Brooke sat in the office, a mix of overwhelming relief that the secret was finally out, and absolute paralyzing dread about what was going to happen next. One of the most relatable and heartbreaking aspects of this moment is Brooke's immediate fear of her father's reaction. She knew with absolute certainty that when he found out she had spoken, his rage would be biblical. She had pulled the pin on the grenade and there was no putting it back. She worried about her siblings still at home. She worried about her mother. She carried the immense, unfair guilt of being the one who broke the family apart, a narrative her parents had planted in her head for years. It is a cruel irony that the victim of the abuse is the one who bears the guilt of exposing it, while the perpetrator often feels perfectly justified in their actions. When the authorities stepped in, the physical separation occurred. Brooke was not allowed to go back to that house of horrors. While this was the technical goal of telling someone, the reality of being suddenly uprooted from everything she knew was incredibly jarring. She left for school that morning as a high school girl carrying a dark secret, and by the afternoon she was a ward of the state, holding nothing but the clothes on her back. This chapter of Brooke's life highlights a crucial truth about surviving trauma. The rescue is often just as chaotic and terrifying as the abuse itself. The adrenaline crash that follows a disclosure leaves the victim feeling hollowed out, exposed, and incredibly vulnerable. She had to repeat her story to strangers with badges and clipboards, answering invasive, deeply personal questions while trying to hold her fractured psyche together. Yet, amidst the chaos, the sirens, and the clinical questions, a tiny, brilliant spark of empowerment had been ignited. Brooke had used her voice. She had taken the ultimate weapon away from her father, her silence. The monster was no longer hiding in the dark. Brooke had dragged him out into the blinding light of truth, and no matter what happened next, her life would never be the same. Point 4. Navigating the maze of foster care. Escaping an abusive home is frequently portrayed in fairy tales and movies as the triumphant end of the nightmare, but the gritty reality is that entering the child protective system can feel like stepping directly into an entirely new, deeply confusing kind of labyrinth. Suddenly removed from everything familiar, Brooke found herself thrust into a cold, bureaucratic world that was designed to protect her, but often left her feeling more isolated, misunderstood, and displaced than ever before. The transition into foster care is a profoundly traumatic event, even when the home being left behind is a violent one. Human beings are wired for connection and familiarity. Even a toxic family is still a family. It is the devil, you know. When Brooke was taken into the system, she experienced the jarring reality that so many foster children face: the sudden reduction of a life into a few items stuffed hastily into a black plastic garbage bag. This imagery, the garbage bag as a suitcase, is a powerful and devastating symbol of how the system unintentionally strips away a child's dignity. It communicates a subtle, heartbreaking message that the child and their belongings are disposable. Brooke was introduced to a revolving door of social workers, each carrying a thick manila folder with her name on it. These professionals were often well-meaning, overworked, and severely under-resourced. To them, Brooke was a case number, a set of allegations, a set of legal requirements that needed to be fulfilled before the end of the day. To Brooke, this was her actual fragile life. The disconnect between the clinical detached process of the state and the deeply emotional, raw reality of the child is a central theme in this phase of her journey. She had to learn a completely new vocabulary: caseworkers, placements, court mandates, and guardians ad litem. Living in a foster home is an exercise in extreme adaptation. Brooke was placed into a strange house with people she didn't know, expected to immediately adhere to their rules, eat their food, and sleep in a strange bed, all while her internal world was completely on fire. She had to navigate the awkwardness of being a guest who couldn't leave, a temporary fixture in someone else's permanent life. Sometimes foster parents are warm and loving, but other times they are distant, treating the situation merely as a transaction. Brooke had to remain hyper-vigilant, scanning these new adults for red flags because her past had taught her that adults are fundamentally dangerous. Moreover, the isolation Brooke felt during this time was suffocating. She was separated from her siblings, the only other people on the planet who truly understood the horrors of the house they grew up in. The system, in its attempt to protect the children, often fractures the sibling bond, which is sometimes the only source of comfort an abused child has. Brooke lay in unfamiliar beds, staring at unfamiliar ceilings, agonizing over where her brothers and sisters were, whether they were safe, and whether they blamed her for the explosion of their family. School, which used to be her sanctuary, now became a source of profound anxiety. The rumor mill in a high school is relentless. People knew something had happened. They whispered in the hallways. Brooke had to walk through the corridors carrying the invisible scarlet letter of being a foster kid. The stigma attached to being in the system is heavy. People often assume the child is a delinquent or a troublemaker, failing to realize that children are in foster care because of what was done to them, not because of what they did. Despite the coldness of the bureaucracy and the ache of displacement, this period was also a crucial crucible for Brooke's independence. Cut off from the oppressive control of her father, she slowly began to realize that she had ownership over her own body and her own choices. She didn't have to map out escape routes when she walked into a room. She didn't have to listen for the sound of tires on gravel. The silence of a normal house was initially terrifying. She was so used to the chaos that peace felt like a trap. But gradually, her nervous system began to decompress. Navigating the foster care maze required Brooke to develop a tough exterior, a thick skin to deflect the pitying looks of caseworkers and the judgment of peers. She learned to advocate for herself because she quickly realized that if she didn't speak up, she would be completely swallowed by the system. This time in the bureaucratic wilderness was grueling, but it was also a vital training ground. It stripped away the last remnants of her childhood innocence, replacing it with a hardened, clear-eyed resilience that she would desperately need for the battles that still lay ahead. She was no longer just surviving a monster in a house, she was learning to survive the world. Point 5. The ultimate betrayal by a mother. When a brave child steps forward to report severe abuse, the deepest, most desperate hope they harbor in their fragile heart is that their non-offending parent will finally wake up from their stupor, stand firmly by their side, and fiercely protect them. Instead, Brooke faced a devastating reality that shattered her heart far more thoroughly than her father's brutal fists ever could. When forced to choose between her child and the monster, her mother unequivocally chose the abuser. This chapter of Brooke's life dives into the darkest, most complex psychological trauma a child can endure. It is one thing to be hunted by a predator. It is an entirely different level of psychic pain to watch the person who gave you life open the door for the wolf and then look the other way. Following Brooke's disclosure and her subsequent removal from the home, the family lines were aggressively drawn in the sand. Instead of rushing to Brooke in tears, begging for forgiveness for failing to protect her, her mother went on the offensive. The mother became the father's most dedicated soldier, launching a campaign of psychological warfare against her own daughter. She actively participated in the attempt to discredit Brooke, painting her as a troubled, lying, dramatic teenager who was making up horrific stories simply to get attention or to act out. This betrayal is a unique brand of agony. It forces the victim to question their own reality. When the person who is biologically designed to love and protect you looks you in the eye and calls you a liar, it creates a profound cognitive dissonance that can take a lifetime of therapy to unravel. Brooke found herself completely ostracized by the family she had practically sacrificed herself to save. The father's manipulation was so deep and the mother's denial so absolute that they managed to brainwash or coerce the other siblings into turning against Brooke as well. She received messages of hate from the people she loved most. They blamed her for the financial ruin of the legal fees, for the public embarrassment, and for the destruction of their perfect family image. Brooke was cast in the role of the villain, the treacherous child who ruined everything, while the father, the actual architect of their misery, was coddled and protected by the mother. To understand this dynamic, one must look at the insidious nature of trauma bonding and codependency. The mother was likely a victim of the father's emotional and perhaps physical abuse herself. Her survival mechanism was absolute compliance to his narrative. Acknowledging that Brooke was telling the truth would mean the mother had to acknowledge her own monstrous failure to protect her children. It would mean her entire life, her marriage, and her identity were built on a foundation of horrific lies. The human mind will go to extraordinary, deeply destructive lengths to avoid facing that level of guilt. So, the mother chose the easier, albeit morally bankrupt path. She threw Brooke to the wolves to save herself. For Brooke, processing this secondary trauma was almost harder than processing the abuse itself. She had to grieve the loss of a mother who was still very much alive. It is a strange, hollow kind of mourning. When someone dies, there is a funeral, a clear endpoint, and the sympathy of the community. When a mother abandons a child to protect an abuser, there is no closure, only an open, festering wound of rejection. Brooke spent countless nights agonizing over the fundamental question, why wasn't I enough? Why wasn't my safety worth fighting for? This period required an immense amount of emotional maturity from a girl who was still just a teenager. Brooke had to learn the agonizing lesson that you cannot force someone to see the truth if their survival depends on keeping their eyes tightly shut. She had to slowly, painfully detach her own self-worth from her mother's rejection. She had to realize that her mother's failure was not a reflection of Brooke's unlovability, but rather a reflection of the mother's profound brokenness. The ultimate betrayal stripped away the last illusions Brooke had about her family. She was truly, completely on her own, but in that devastating isolation, a fierce, unbreakable core of strength was forged. She realized that if her mother would not stand up for her, she would have to stand up for herself with twice the ferocity. The pain of the mother's betrayal burned away the lingering doubts. Brooke stopped waiting to be rescued and stopped yearning for a family that never truly existed. She squared her shoulders and prepared to face her abuser, not as a frightened daughter hoping for a mother's hand to hold, but as an independent survivor demanding justice. Point 6. Standing tall in the courtroom. The American courtroom is a sterile, highly structured, and deeply intimidating arena where the most intimate, agonizing personal traumas are brutally dissected under bright fluorescent lights in the cold, unfeeling scrutiny of the law. Walking into that cavernous room to face the man who had terrorized her entire life required a level of raw, unadulterated bravery that Brooke had to summon from the deepest, most fractured parts of her soul. Preparing for a criminal trial as the primary victim and star witness is an exhausting ordeal that often feels like a second victimization. Brooke had to spend hours with prosecutors, going over every horrific detail of the abuse again and again, ensuring her statements were airtight. The legal system is not designed to comfort victims, it is designed to test evidence. Brooke had to learn how to speak about the most degrading moments of her life with clinical precision, stripping the emotion away so that a jury could digest the facts. She knew that the defense attorney's entire job was to destroy her credibility, to paint her as a liar, a manipulator, or a deeply troubled teen suffering from false memories. The day of the trial arrived with a sickening jolt of adrenaline. Entering the courtroom, the physical atmosphere felt thick enough to choke on. And then, there he was, her father, the man who had acted as the omnipotent god of her childhood, the monster who had haunted her every waking moment and her darkest nightmares, was sitting just a few feet away at the defense table. The physical sensation of being in the same room as an abuser after escaping them is indescribable. The body remembers the trauma even if the mind tries to stay strong. Brooke's heart raced, her hands shook, and the primal urge to run away and hide almost overwhelmed her. He used every silent tactic in his arsenal, the glare, the subtle shifts in posture, the sneer, to try and intimidate her from across the room, attempting to assert the dominance he once held. But the courtroom belonged to the judge, not to him. When Brooke was called to the witness stand, she took the long walk to the front of the room, feeling the eyes of the jury, the judge, her estranged family members, and her abuser burning into her back. Sitting in that wooden chair, raising her right hand, and swearing to tell the truth was the ultimate culmination of her journey. She gripped the edges of the witness stand, grounded herself, and looked out at the room. Testifying is an act of walking through fire. The prosecutor guided her gently through the timeline, asking her to recount the unspeakable acts her father had committed. Brooke had to force the words out of her throat, speaking the ugly, terrifying truth into the microphone so that it echoed off the wood-paneled walls. She wept, her voice cracked, but she did not stop. She laid bare the reality of the spilled milk house, exposing the monster behind the suburban mask. Then came the cross-examination. The defense attorney approached the podium, armed with the blatant lies her father and mother had concocted. The questions were designed to confuse her, to trip her up, and to make her doubt her own sanity. Aren't you just angry that your father disciplined you? Didn't you make this up because you wanted to move out? Your own mother says you are lying. Why should this jury believe you? The psychological assault was relentless. It is an incredibly cruel aspect of the justice system that a victim must endure, being verbally battered in order to secure a conviction. Yet, in the crucible of that cross-examination, Brooke discovered the absolute power of an unshakable truth. She realized she didn't need to outsmart the lawyer, she just needed to hold firmly to what she knew happened. Her answers were steadfast. She looked directly at the jury, letting them see the undeniable pain and the absolute sincerity in her eyes. She even found the strength to look directly at her father. In that moment of eye contact, the dynamic shifted fundamentally. She was no longer the terrified little girl cowering in her bedroom. She was a grown woman, bathed in the light of the truth, holding a mirror up to his monstrosity. When Brooke finally stepped down from the witness stand, she was physically and emotionally drained to the point of collapse, but her spirit was soaring. She had faced the beast in its own den, and she had not blinked. Regardless of what the jury decided, Brooke had already won her personal victory. She had reclaimed her narrative, she had spoken her truth loudly and without apology, and she had proven to herself that the man sitting at the defense table held no power over her anymore. He was just a small, pathetic man in a suit, and she was a warrior who had survived his worst. Point 7. The conclusion. A guilty verdict may provide profound legal closure and a societal validation of the truth, but the real grueling work of healing only truly begins when the judge's gavel falls and the survivor is left to figure out how to actually live a life free from terror. Brooke's remarkable journey from a traumatized victim to becoming K L Randis, a fierce advocate and celebrated author, stands as a breathtaking testament to the incredible, boundless resilience of the human spirit. When the verdict was read and the father was finally held accountable, convicted, and sent to prison, a massive, suffocating weight was lifted from Brooke's chest. The boogeyman had been locked away. For the first time in her entire life, she could go to sleep knowing with absolute certainty that her door would not burst open in the middle of the night. However, surviving abuse is vastly different from living a healthy life. Trauma leaves deep, jagged scars on the brain and the nervous system that do not magically disappear when the abuser is put in handcuffs. The aftermath of the trial ushered in a long, slow, and often painful process of unlearning. Brooke had to actively dismantle the toxic survival mechanisms she had built to protect herself. She had to learn that a disagreement with a friend or partner would not result in physical violence. She had to learn how to accept kindness without suspicion, recognizing that not every gift comes with a sinister string attached. Therapy played a crucial role in this phase, acting as a mental, physical therapy to rebuild the muscles of trust, self-worth, and emotional regulation. She had to mourn the childhood she was robbed of and the family she never truly had, allowing herself to feel the anger and the grief without letting it consume her future. The decision to write her story and publish Spilled Milk was the ultimate act of reclaiming her power. By transitioning from Brooke, the hidden victim, to K L Randis, the outspoken author, she took the ugliest, most painful parts of her life and forged them into a tool of immense purpose. Writing the book was undoubtedly a triggering and agonizing process, forcing her to walk back through the dark hallways of her memory. But putting the trauma down on paper transferred the weight from her soul onto the pages. The book became a tangible boundary between her past and her present. More importantly, publishing her story transformed her pain into a beacon for others. Spilled Milk resonated deeply with thousands of survivors around the world who had felt invisible and silenced by their own families. K L Randis stepped into the light not just as a survivor, but as a fierce advocate for children trapped in the system she had so painfully navigated. She used her platform to educate social workers, to inspire other victims to speak out, and to shine a glaring spotlight on the massive failures of the domestic violence and child protective systems. She proves that while we cannot control the horrific things that happen to us, we have absolute authority over what we do with the aftermath. The metaphor of the spilled milk comes full circle in this final chapter of her healing. In the dark days of her childhood, spilled milk was a catalyst for terror, a symbol of the impossible perfection demanded by a monster. In her new life, spilled milk is exactly what it should be: a minor, meaningless accident. It represents the freedom to make mistakes, the grace to be human, and the profound, quiet joy of living in a home where love is not conditional and safety is guaranteed. K L Randis' story does not end with a fairy tale erasure of all pain. The scars remain, the memories of the mother's betrayal and the father's cruelty will always be a part of her history, but they no longer sit in the driver's seat of her life. She built a new foundation of hope out of the rubble of her past, creating her own chosen family, establishing healthy boundaries, and dedicating her life to ensuring that the voices of abused children are heard. Her journey reminds us all that no matter how deep the darkness, the human capacity to seek the light, to fight for justice, and to fiercely, unapologetically heal is stronger than any monster hiding behind closed doors.